Invention of the World Wide Web. In 1989, while working at CERN, Tim Berners-Lee wrote a proposal to build a hypertext system over the Internet, initially called the Mesh. It was later renamed the World Wide Web during its implementation in 1990. Built over the existing TCP and IP protocols, it consisted of four building blocks: a textual format to represent hypertext documents, the hypertext markup language, a protocol to exchange these documents, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, a client to display and edit these documents, the first web browser called the World Wide Web, a server to give access to the document, an early version of HTTP. These four building blocks were completed by the end of 1990, and the first servers were running outside CERN by early 1991. On August 6, 1991, Tim Berners-Lee posted on the public Alt Hypertext newsgroup. This is now considered to be the official start of the World Wide Web as a public project. The HTTP protocol used in those early phases was very simple. It was later dubbed HTTP 0.9 and it is sometimes called the one-line protocol. HTTP 0.9, the one-line protocol. The initial version of HTTP has no version number. It was later called 0.9 to differentiate it from later versions. HTTP 0.9 was extremely simple. Requests considered of a single line and started with the only possible method get, followed by the path to the resource. The full URL wasn't included at the protocol. Server and the port weren't necessary once connected to the server. The response was extremely simple, too. It only consisted of the file itself. Unlike subsequent evolutions, there were no HTTP headers. This meant that only HTTP files could be transmitted. There were no status or error codes. If there was a problem, a specific HTML file was generated and included in a description of the problem for human consumption. HTTP 1.0, building extensibility. HTTP 0.9 was very limited, but browsers and servers quickly made it more versatile. Versioning information was sent within each request. HTTP 1.0 was appended to the GET line. A status code line was also sent at the beginning of a response. This allowed the browser itself to recognize the success or failure of a request and adapted its behavior accordingly. For example, updating or using its local cache in a specific way. The concept of HTTP headers was introduced for both requests and responses, but the data could be transmitted and the protocol became extremely flexible and extensible. Documents other than plain HTML files could be transmitted thanks to the content type header. At this point in time, a typical request and response looked like this. It was followed by a second connection and a request to fetch the image with the corresponding response. Between 1991 and 1995, these were introduced with a try and see approach. A server and a browser would add a feature and see if it got traction. Interoperability problems were common in an effort to solve these issues. An information document that described the common practices was published in November 1996. This was known as RFC 1945 and defined HTTP 1.0. HTTP 1.1, the standardized protocol. In the meantime, proper standardization was in progress. This happened in parallel to the diverse Implementations of HTTP 1.0. The first standardized version of HTTP, HTTP 1.1, was published in early 1997. Only a few months after HTTP 1.0, HTTP 1.1 clarified ambiguities and introduced numerous improvements. The connection could be reused, which saved time. It no longer need to be opened multiple times to display the resource embedded in the single original document. Pipeline was added. This allowed a second request to be sent before the answer to the first one was fully transmitted. This lowered the latency of the communication. Trunked responses were also supported. Additional cache control mechanisms were introduced. Content negotiation, including language, encoding, and type, was introduced. The client and the server could now agree on which content to exchange. Thanks to the host header, the ability to host different domains from the same IP address allowed server collocation. The following example illustrates a typical sequence of HTTP 1.1 requests sent over a single persistent TCP connection, demonstrating how clients can reuse connections to load resources more efficiently. The first request retrieves a web page, and the server responds with an HTML document. The client then sends additional requests sequentially as it counters CSS and JavaScript resources in the HTML. Setting up a TCP connection is an expensive part of the client-server exchange. The TCP slow start means that longer-lived connections are faster than newly created ones. HTTP 1.1 allows you to reuse a TCP connection for multiple requests and responses, so you avoid having to create a new connection for each request. However, clients still had to wait for each resource to download before requesting the next one, head-of-line blocking. To work around this, most browsers allow up to 6 TCP connections per website or region. With 6 parallel connections, browsers can fetch multiple resources simultaneously using the HTTP 1.1 model. This had added significant performance improvements. HTTP 1.1 was first published as RFC 2068 in January 1997.